Recording by Rachel. Saved at Sea by Mrs. O. F. Walton. Chapter 1. My Strange Home. It was a strange day, the day that I was born. The waves were beating against the lighthouse, and the wind was roaring and raging against everything. Had not the lighthouse been built very firmly into the strong solid rock, it, and all within it, must have been swept into the deep wild sea. It was a terrible storm. My grandfather said he had never known such a storm since he came to live on the island, more than 40 years ago. Many ships went down in the storm that day, and many lives were lost. But in the very midst of it, when the wind was highest, and the waves were strongest, and when the foam and the spray had completely covered the lighthouse windows, I, Alec Fergusson, was born. I was born on a strange day, and I was born into a strange home. The lighthouse stood on an island 4 miles distant from any land. The island was not very large. If you stood in the middle of it, you could see the sea all round you, that sea which was sometimes so blue and peaceful, and at other times was as black as ink, and roaring and thundering on the rocky shores of the little island. At one side of the island, on a steep rock overhanging the sea, stood the lighthouse. Night by night, as soon as it began to grow dark, the lighthouse lamps were lighted. I can remember how I used to admire those lights as a child. I would sit for hours watching them revolve and change in color. First there was a white light, then a blue one, then a red one, then a green one, then a white one again. And as the ships went by, they always kept a lookout for our friendly lights, and avoided the rocks of which they warned them. My grandfather, old Sandy Fergusson, was one of the lighthouse men, whose duty it was always to keep these lamps in order and to light them every night. He was a clever, active old man, and did his work well and cheerfully. His great desire was to be able to hold on at his post till I should be able to take his place. At the time when my story begins I was nearly 12 years old, and daily growing taller and stronger. My grandfather was very proud of me, and said I should soon be a young man, and then he should get me appointed in his place to look after the lighthouse. I was very fond of my strange home, and would not have changed it for any other. Many people would have thought it dull, for we seldom saw a strange face, and the lighthouse men were only allowed to go on shore for a few hours once in every 2 months. But I was very happy, and thought there was no place in the world like our little island. Close to the tower of the lighthouse was the house in which I and my grandfather lived. It was not a large house, but it was a very pleasant one. All the windows looked out over the sea, and plenty of sharp sea air came in whenever they were opened. All the furniture in the house belonged to the lighthouse, and had been there long before my grandfather came to live there. Our cups and saucers and plates had the name of the lighthouse on them in large gilt letters, and a little picture of the lighthouse with the waves dashing round it. I used to think them very pretty when I was a boy. We had not many neighbours. There was only one other house on the island, and it was built on the other side of the lighthouse tower. The house belonged to Mr. Miller, who shared the care of the lighthouse with my grandfather. Just outside the 2 houses was a court, with a pump in the middle, from which we got our water. There was a high wall all round this court, to make little shelter for us from the stormy wind. Beyond this court were 2 gardens, divided by an iron railing. The miller's garden was very untidy and forlorn, and filled with nettles, and thistles, and groundsel, and all kinds of weeds, for Mr. Miller did not care for gardening, and Mrs. Miller had 6 little children, and had no time to look after it. But our garden was the admiration of every one who visited the island. My grandfather and I were at work on it in every fine day, and took a pride in keeping it as neat as possible. Although it was so near the sea, our garden produced most beautiful vegetables and fruit, and the borders were filled with flowers, cabbage roses and pansies, and wallflowers, and many other hardy plants which were not afraid of the sea air. Outside the garden was a good-sized field, full of small hillocks, over which the wild rabbits and hares, with which the island abounded, were continually scampering. In this field were kept a cow and 2 goats, to supply the 2 families with milk and butter. Beyond it was the rocky shore, and a little pier built out into the sea. On this pier I used to stand every Monday morning, to watch for the steamer which called at the island once a week. It was a great event to us when the steamer came. My grandfather and I, and Mr. and Mrs. Miller and the children, all came down to the shore to welcome it. This steamer brought out our provisions for the week, from a town some miles off, and often brought a letter from Mr. Miller, or a newspaper from my grandfather. My grandfather did not get many letters, for there were not many people that he knew. He had lived on that lonely island the greater part of his life, and had been quite shut out from the world. All his relations were dead now except my father, and what had become of him we did not know. I had never seen him, for he went away some time before I was born. My father was a sailor, a fine, tall, strong young fellow, my grandfather used to say. He had brought my mother to the island, and left her in my grandfather's care whilst he went on a voyage to Australia. He went from the island in that same little steamer which called every Monday morning. My grandfather stood on the end of the pier as the steamer went out of sight, and my mother waved her handkerchief to him as long as any smoke was seen on the horizon. Grandfather has often told me how young and pretty she looked that summer morning. My father had promised to write soon, but no letter ever came. Mother went down to the pier every morning for 3 long years, to see if it had brought her any word from her sailor husband. But after a time her step became slower and her face paler, and at last she was too weak to go down the rocks to the pier when the steamer arrived on a Monday morning. And soon after this I was left motherless. From that day, the day on which my mother died, my grandfather became both father and mother to me. There was nothing he would not have done for me, and wherever he went and whatever he did I was always by his side. As I grew older, he taught me to read and write, for there was of course no school which I could attend. I also learnt to help him trim the lamps, and to work in the garden. Our life went on very evenly from day to day until I was about 12 years old. I used to wish sometimes that something new would happen to make a little change on the island. And at last a change came. End of chapter 1. Chapter 2. The Flare at Sea. My grandfather and I were sitting at tea one dark November evening. We had been digging in the garden the whole morning, but in the afternoon it had become so wet and stormy that we had remained indoors. We were sitting quietly at our tea, planning what we would do the next day, when the door suddenly opened and Mr. Miller put his head in. "Sandy, quick!" he said. "Look here!" My grandfather and I ran to the door and looked out over the sea. There, about 3 miles to the north of us, we saw a bright flare of light. It blazed up for a moment or two, lighting up the wild and stormy sky, then it went out, and all was darkness again. "What is it, grandfather?" I asked, but he did not answer me. "There's no time to lose, Jem," he said. "Out with the boat, my man." "It's an awful sea," said Mr. Miller, looking at the waves beating fiercely against the rocks. "Never mind, Jem," said my grandfather. "We must do our best." So the 2 men went down to the shore, and I followed them. "What is it, grandfather?" I asked again. "There's something wrong out there," said he, pointing to the place where we had seen the light. "That's the flare they always make when they're in danger and want help at once." "Are you going to them, grandfather?" I said. "Yes, if we can get the boat out," he said. "Now, Jem, are you ready?" "Let me go with you, grandfather," I said. "I might be able to help." "All right, my lad," he said. "We'll try if we can get her off." I can see that scene with my mind's eye as though it were but yesterday. My grandfather and Mr. Miller straining every nerve to row the boat from land, whilst I clung to one of the seats, and tried in vain to steer her. I can see poor Mrs. Miller standing on the pier, with her shawl over her head, watching us, and 2 of her little girls clinging to her dress. I can see the waves, which seemed to be rising higher every moment, and ready to beat our little boat to pieces. And I can see my grandfather's disappointed face, as, after many a fruitless attempt, he was obliged to give it up. "It's no use, I'm afraid, Jem," he said at last. "We haven't hands enough to manage her." So we got to shore as best we could, and paced up and down the little pier. We could see nothing more. It was a very dark night, and all was perfect blackness over the sea. The lighthouse lamps were burning brightly. They had been lighted more than 2 hours before. It was Miller's turn to watch, so he went up to the tower, and my grandfather and I remained on the pier. "Can nothing be done, grandfather?" "I'm afraid not, my lad. We can't make any way against such a sea as this. If it goes down a bit, we'll have another try at it." But the sea did not go down. We walked up and down the pier almost in silence. Presently a rocket shot up into the sky, evidently from the same place where we had seen the flare. "There she is again, Alick. Poor things, I wonder how many of them there is." "Can we do nothing at all?" I asked again. "No, my lad," he said. "The sea's too much for us. It's a terrible night. It puts me in mind of the day you were born." So the night wore away. We never thought of going to bed, but walked up and down the pier, with our eyes fixed on the place where we had seen the lights. Every now and then, for some hours, rockets were sent up, and then they ceased, and we saw nothing. "They've got no more with them," said my grandfather. "Poor things, it's a terrible bad job." "What's wrong with them, grandfather?" I asked. "Are there rocks over there?" "Yes, there's the Ainslie Crag just there. It's a nasty place, that, a very nasty place. Many a fine ship has been lost there." At last the day began to dawn. A faint grey light spread over the sea. We could distinguish now the masts of a ship in the far distance. "There she is, poor thing," said my grandfather, pointing at the direction of the ship. "She's close on Ainslie Crag. I thought so." "The wind's gone down a bit now, hasn't it?" I asked. "Yes, and the sea's a bit stiller just now," he said. "Give Jem a call, Alick." Jem Miller hastened down to the pier with his arms full of rope. "All right, Jem, my lad," said my grandfather. "Let's be off. I think we may manage it now." So we jumped into the boat and put off from the pier. It was a fearful struggle with the wind and waves, and for a long time we seemed to make no way against them. Both the men were much exhausted, and Jem Miller seemed ready to give in. "Cheer up, Jem, my lad," said my grandfather. "Think of all the poor fellows out there. Let's have one more try." So they made a mighty effort, and the pier was left a little way behind. Slowly, very slowly, we made that distance greater. Slowly, very slowly, Mrs. Miller, who was standing on the shore, faded from our sight, and the masts of the ship in distress seemed to grow a little more near. Yet the waves were still fearfully strong, and appeared ready, every moment, to swallow up our little boat. Would my grandfather and Miller ever be able to hold on till they reached the ship, which was still more than 2 miles away? "What's that?" I cried, as I caught sight of a dark object rising and falling with the waves. "It's a boat, surely," said my grandfather. "Look, Jem." End of chapter 2. Chapter 3. The Bundle Saved. It was a boat of which I had caught sight, a boat bottom upwards. A minute afterwards it swept close past us, so near that we could almost touch it. "They've lost their boat. Pull away, Jem." "Oh, grandfather," I said, and the wind was so high I could only make him hear by shouting, "Grandfather, do you think the boat was full?" "No," he said. "I think they've tried to put her off, and she's been swept away. Keep up, Jem," for Jem Miller, who was not a strong man, seemed ready to give in. We were now considerably more than half-way between the boat and the ship. It seemed as if those on board had caught sight of us, for another rocket went up. They had evidently kept one back, as a last hope, in case anyone should pass by. As we drew nearer, we could see that it was a large ship, and we could distinguish many forms moving about on deck. Poor fellows, said my grandfather. "Pull away, Jem." Nearer and nearer we came to the ship, till at length we could see her quite distinctly. She had struck on Ainslie Crag, and her stern was under water, and the waves were beating wildly on her deck. We could see men clinging to the rigging which remained, and holding on to the broken masts of the ship. I shall never forget that sight to my dying day. My grandfather and Jem Miller saw it, and they pulled on desperately. And now we were so near to the vessel that had it not been for the storm which was raging, we could have spoken to those on board. Again and again we tried to come alongside the shattered ship, but were swept away by the rush of the strong, resistless waves. Several of the sailors came to the side of the ship and threw out a rope to us. It was long before we could catch it, but at last we were being carried past it. I clutched it, and my grandfather immediately made it secure. "Now," he cried, "steady, Jem, we shall save some of them yet," and he pulled the boat as near as possible to the ship. Oh, how my heart beat that moment, as I looked at the men and women all crowding towards the place where the rope was fastened. "We can't take them all," said my grandfather anxiously. "We must cut the rope when we've got as many as the boat will carry." I shuddered, as I thought of those who would be left behind. We had now come so close to the ship that the men on board would be able to watch their opportunity, and jump into the boat whenever a great wave was passed, and there was a lull for a moment in the storm. "Look out, Jem!" cried my grandfather. "Here's the first." A man was standing by the rope, with what appeared to be a bundle in his arms. The moment we came near, he seized his opportunity and threw it to us. My grandfather caught it. "It's a child, Alick," he said. "Put it down by you." I put the bundle at my feet, and my grandfather cried, "Now another, quick, my lads!" But at this moment Jem Miller seized his arm. "Sandy, look out!" he almost shrieked. My grandfather turned round. A mighty wave, bigger than any I had seen before, was coming towards us. In another moment we should have been dashed by its violence against the ship, and all have perished. My grandfather hastily let go the rope, and we just got out of the way of the ship before the wave reached us. And then came a noise, loud as a terrible thunderclap, as the mighty wave dashed against Ainslie Crag. I could hardly breathe, so dreadful was the moment. "Now back again for some more," cried my grandfather, when the wave had passed. We looked round, but the ship was gone. It had disappeared like a dream when one wakes, as if it had never been. That mighty wave had broken its back and shattered it into 1,000 fragments. Nothing was to be seen of the ship or its crew but a few floating pieces of timber. My grandfather and Miller pulled hastily to the spot, but it was some time before we could reach it, for we had been carried by the sea almost a mile away, and the storm seemed to be increasing in violence. When at last we reached that terrible Ainslie Crag, we were too late to save a single life. We could not find one of those on board. The greater number, no doubt, had been carried down in the vortex made by the sinking ship, and the rest had risen and sunk long before we reached them. For some time we battled with the waves, unwilling to relinquish all hope of saving some of them, but we found at last that it was of no use, and we were obliged to return. All had perished, except the child lying at my feet. I stooped down to it, and could hear that it was crying, but it was so tightly tied up in the blanket that I could not see nor release it. We had to strain every nerve to reach the lighthouse. It was not so hard returning as going, for the wind was in our favour, but the sea was still strong, and we were often in great danger. I kept my eyes fixed on the lighthouse lamps, and steered the boat as straight as I could. Oh, how thankful we were to see those friendly lights growing near! And at last the pier came into sight, and Mrs. Miller still standing there watching us. "Have you got none of them?" she said, as we came up the steps. "Nothing but a child," said my grandfather sadly. "Only one small child, that's all. We did our best, Jem, my lad." Jem was following my grandfather, with the oars over his shoulder. I came at last, with that little bundle in my arms. The child had stopped crying now, and seemed to be asleep, it was so still. Mrs. Miller wanted to take it from me, and to undo the blanket, but my grandfather said, "Bide your time, Mary. Bring the child into the house, my lass. It's bitter cold out here." So we all went up through the field, and through our garden and the court. The blanket was tightly fastened round the child, except at the top, where room had been left for it to breathe, and I could just see a little nose and 2 closed eyes as I peeped in at the opening. The bundle was a good weight, and before I reached the house I was glad of Mrs. Miller's help to carry it. We came into our little kitchen, and Mrs. Miller took the child on her knee, and unfastened the blanket. "Bless her," she said, as her tears fell fast. "It's a little girl." "Ay," said my grandfather, "so it is, a bonny wee lassie." End of chapter 3.